This man was mistakenly locked up in one of the most dangerous prisons in the world. His name is Kilmar Ábrego García, and he, along with many other innocent people, was unjustly imprisoned inside Cecot, a penitentiary facility in El Salvador that some organizations have described as a black hole for human rights. But how did an innocent person end up in there? Kilmar is a young man of Salvadoran origin, born in 1995, who grew up in an environment of violence and extortion. In this country, in fact, gangs held enormous power. It was an extremely violent and dangerous environment for anyone who wasn't a criminal. And precisely for this reason, both he and his brother were made to emigrate illegally to the United States by their parents. It was certainly a long and risky journey, but once they reached the United States, everything started to go well, at least until 2025. At the beginning of the year, the Trump administration made agreements with Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, to send some of the most important members of US gangs to their new mega prison. So summary trials were held, and that's how Kilmar, who had fled El Salvador precisely because of the gangs, found himself not only labeled a terrorist, but was also forcibly transported to the Cecot, that is, the Confinement Center for Terrorism. But what exactly is this facility like? Built in 2023, about an hour's drive from the country's capital, San Salvador, the Cecot is a gigantic maximum security prison. Inside, it can hold up to 40,000 inmates, although for security reasons, the exact number has never actually been made public, and it is estimated that at the moment it is at least half full. The perimeter of the facility is surrounded by a long wall of reinforced concrete, and each of the 4 prison blocks is in turn enclosed by 2 rows of walls and fences topped with electrified wire. To ensure even greater security, 19 watchtowers have also been installed. Inside each block there are 2 wings, and in each wing there are 32 cells. And we shouldn't think of the cells as the ones we're used to. We're talking about maxi cells, each capable of holding between 65 and 70 prisoners. As you can imagine, this is an enormous place where order and security are the top priorities. That's why as many as 600 soldiers from the armed forces work here, along with another 250 officers from the National Civil Police, to ensure constant surveillance 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Furthermore, to block any possible communication with the outside, the cell phone signal is jammed in an area with a radius of about 2.5 kilometers around the prison. But what is life like inside the cells? The first thing that stands out are these huge metal beds. In fact, here at Cecot, there are no cots. Inmates sleep directly on the metal slabs. They, moreover, are not allowed to have any kind of personal belongings. Just think, in the cells, besides the beds, there are only 2 toilets, so no privacy, 2 sinks, and 2 Bibles. That's it. The only time they can leave the cell is the half hour a day when they are taken to the corridor for physical activity. As for the food, every meal is the same as the last, and consists of rice, beans, hard-boiled eggs or pasta, which must be eaten strictly with their hands. Mealtime is an especially important moment because it is essentially the only way for the inmates to keep track of the passing of time. In fact, at Cecot there are no windows at all, and the artificial lights remain on for 24 hours a day, which really disorients the prisoners. Actually, there is a so-called dark room, but no one ever wants to end up in there. I'm talking about the isolation cell, which is used to punish inmates who try to rebel. Here, there is only a small opening in the ceiling, and often the inmate has to remain locked up in total darkness in this concrete hole for 1 or 2 weeks straight. As you might have guessed, this is a harsh place where no misstep is tolerated. But why are there all these security measures? Are the inmates really that dangerous? To answer this important question, we need to take a small step back in time, briefly, and start with Nayib Bukele, who is the current president of El Salvador. Nayib Bukele was elected president of El Salvador in 2019, after 3 years as mayor of the capital. From the very beginning, his approach has been to lower the country's crime rate. Keep in mind that until a few years ago, El Salvador was one of the countries with the highest crime rates in the world. In 2021, for example, a rate of 17 homicides per 100,000 people was recorded. These extremely high crime rates, as we've mentioned, were mainly linked to the overwhelming power of gangs like the Mara Salvatrucha and the 18th Street Gang. In fact, even though there was a formal government, a large part of the territory was actually in their hands. And this is where Bukele comes into play. His election campaign revolved entirely around the determination to solve this problem by any means necessary. He therefore gave the police and the army almost absolute power, and anyone even just suspected of being affiliated with a gang, even without any evidence, could be arrested. Keep this in mind because it will be important later on. With this approach, he managed to imprison around 80,000 people in just a few months, turning El Salvador from the country with the highest murder rate to the one with the highest incarceration rate, since about 2% of the population had been put in handcuffs. At the same time, the number of homicides dropped by about 50 times between 2015 and 2023. Obviously, the government did not miss the chance to publicize its actions, repeatedly showing these striking images of tattooed inmates running under lines of armed soldiers and being thrown into cells with their longtime rivals without any way to resist. With this move, the president has therefore gained the approval of a large portion of the Salvadoran people, who now live in a much safer country, and he has managed to create such an authoritative image that he was even able to make deals with Trump to receive their gang members. And seen this way, this structure might actually seem like a solution to the problem of crime, however drastic, but in reality, there's more to it. The first criticism that is directed at the Cecot pertains to the conditions in which the inmates live. We've already talked about this, so I don't want to repeat myself, but it's clear that these are extreme conditions simply due to the fact that each inmate has a living space of just 0.6 square meters, or the fact that no prisoner is ever allowed to see their loved ones in person, only through video calls monitored by guards. Another very critical aspect is related to the arrest procedure. Do you remember that a little while ago I told you that the police and the army have the power to arrest anyone for terrorism, even without evidence? Well, as you can easily imagine, this can very easily lead to the imprisonment of innocent people. All the more so since the government has set up a toll-free number to report alleged terrorists. That is, if you don't like your neighbor, even if they're not actually part of a gang, you can report them and maybe the authorities will really arrest them, and only afterwards will it be determined if they're innocent. And it's precisely because of this mechanism that Kilmar Ábrego García, the main character at the beginning of our story, was also imprisoned. He was deported without receiving a fair trial. Fortunately, his story quickly became a media case, so his release did not take long, although the same cannot be said for the many innocent Salvadorans whose conditions are unknown to us. In fact, everything we know about the prison is only what the government wants us to know. It is impossible for any external organization to verify the conditions of the facility as a whole with their own eyes, since even the increasingly rare press visits are strictly controlled by guards and follow predetermined routes. The only dissenting voices are from relatives who report the unjustified arrest of loved ones, but who, in only a few cases, can bring enough evidence to court to have them released. It is thanks to the testimonies of these relatives that serious doubts have also arisen regarding the conduct of the guards inside the prison. On several occasions, the officers have been accused of mistreatment or of denying food and medical care to prisoners. In fact, in approximately 260 individual cases, it is suspected that intentional murders were committed, given the clear signs of lacerations, severe beatings, and strangulation on the victims' bodies. Guys, thank you for following me up to this point. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any doubts or other questions about this topic, write them in the comments. And if you happen to be from El Salvador, I'd also be curious to know your opinion, whether you knew about this story and how this issue is perceived in your country.